that's pretty much it for the digestive system. I think the next system that we need to talk about are skeletal systems. Okay. All right, so a skeleton. Lots of the animals have a skeleton. The skeleton is important for support, protection, and movement. So some examples here. My spinal column is part of my skeleton and it helps support my body in an upright position. My rib cage is part of my skeleton, and its job is to protect the internal organs inside the thoracic cavity. And by hooking muscles up to my bones within the skeletal system, I can move the bones and move myself from one place to the other as well. Okay? Now, there are a few different types of skeletal systems, how we could organize these skeletal systems. The first type is referred to as a hydrostatic skeleton. Mentioned a little bit about this before. That's the type of skeleton that we find in an earthworm. What we're going to do in this earthworm is run some muscle groups this way and run some other muscle groups this way. Okay? By contracting on these circular muscle bands, I can put fluid under them under pressure, and that makes that fluid hard, right? When you put water under pressure, you get a fairly rigid structure. So this and this are now rigid because of the water under pressure in those cavities. Then what I'm going to do is contract on these muscles, and that will pull these two closer together. Right? I now pulled those two closer together. So the idea is by doing this in different parts of the body, right, I can use this for movement. Okay? Now, hydrostatic skeletons, phylum Annelida, things like earthworms, but the trunk of an elephant and your tongue are also hydrostatic skeletons. There are no bones in your tongue, right? There's no cartilage in your tongue. What's there are a bunch of compartments that can be put under pressure by contracting different muscle groups, and that allows the tongue to be moved in different directions. Okay? All right. The second type of skeleton is called a rigid skeleton. Okay? This one should be fairly straightforward. The rigid skeleton is made up of rigid elements. And rigid elements are structures that don't move very easily. They resist deforming in shape. They're very rigid. Okay? All right, and then what we're going to do is use these rigid elements with anchor points for muscles to be able to move the rigid elements around. So let's do my arm here. Right, I'm going to put a bone there, and then let's, right, there's my radius and ulna. That would be my humerus here, radius and ulna here. Then what I could do is connect these rigid elements with muscle, and then by contracting the muscle, that would pull one rigid element toward the other. Then, when I want to put everything back the way it was, I would use a separate muscle group, and contraction here would pull the rigid element in this direction. Okay? Now, the muscle groups associated with a skeleton like ours are arranged in groups. There are particular muscle groups associated with extension and muscle groups associated with flexion. Flexion of muscles and extension. Okay? Flexion and extension. Right now, the rigid skeletons are divided into different categories based on where these skeletons are. So the first group of rigid skeletons would be referred to as exoskeletons. So an exoskeleton here on this spiny lobster, that's an external structure, right, made on the outside of the organism. And then what we could do is hook the muscles up to the inside of exoskeleton in different parts of the body. So the muscles are hooked up to the inside of the exoskeleton. Okay? Exoskeletons could be shells. They could be I guess we call it a shell on a lobster too. But we could make this out of different material. So some of these would be calcareous structures, meaning they're made out of calcium. Some of these structures could be proteinaceous, meaning that the exoskeleton is made out of protein. And some of these structures, whoops, I think it's chitinous actually. Yeah, chitinous. Tendency in biology to make things more complicated than they should be. Chitinous, that's that polymer of N-acetylglucosamine. Think insects, they make chitin. So we can make this exoskeleton out of different material, right? Protein, minerals, or N-acetylglucosamine. Okay? All right, the second type of rigid skeleton is called an endoskeleton. In an endoskeleton, the skeleton is internal to the body. So there are two main groups that do endoskeletons. The first group is the echinoderms, and the second group are the chordates. The echinoderms make an endoskeleton that's calcareous, and then they have tissue over the top of that endoskeleton. Chordates make an endoskeleton, and then the body is arranged around it. The materials that are used to manufacture endoskeletons, protein, cartilage, and bone. Protein we'll talk about in a second, think notochord. Cartilage, think the cartilaginous fish like sharks, skates, and rays. And then bone, that would be the vertebrates like us, right? Mammals, plus the higher ones like amphibians, reptiles, and birds. Also, you could include the bony fish there as well. Okay? Now, of these skeleton types, the bone is the most rigid element of any of these. And in addition to supporting and protecting, bony skeletons also serve as a major reservoir for calcium and phosphorus. The idea is it's handy to have a place where you're storing large amounts of calcium and phosphorus. Why would we want to store large amounts of calcium? Well, all of our cells use calcium as a secondary messenger. Think of that IP3 system for one of those examples. Also think about calcium being used to cause fusion of those neurotransmitter vesicles, right? It's an important nutrient here. All cells need it. They may not be able to store as much as they need, so the body stores extra in case it's needed. Phosphorus is important in the form of phosphate groups. All cells have to have phosphate groups, otherwise they can't phosphorylate anything. So that storage means you're not going to run out of it, hopefully. Okay? And also, in the amniotes, that's the tetrapods minus the amphibians. So the amniotes includes the reptiles, birds, and mammals. In the amniotes, the red blood cells are made in bone, the large bones, and some of the white blood cells are also made in bone. Okay? All right, simplest form of an endoskeleton, that's the complex one, but the simple form of an endoskeleton is in some of the primitive chordates, right? They, instead of reabsorbing the notochord during development like we do, they would leave the notochord there, and that's their endoskeleton. Just a single rod down the length of this protochordate, down the length of this thing called a cephalochordate. It's a chordate with a head, but this long anterior-posterior rod. Okay? All right. Okay. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the organization of the vertebrate skeleton. That's our skeleton here, the vertebrate skeleton. There's a nice little vertebrate skeleton right there. And the vertebrate skeleton is composed of two parts. What's called an axial skeleton. Right? Think axis, like the axis on a plot, and an appendicular. Think appendicular, appendix, which is ancillary to something that's already there, right? The appendix of a textbook. In my diagram here, the axial skeleton is labeled in it's like a tannish brown, and then this more bluish green is the appendicular skeleton. So if you look there, the axial skeleton would include the skull, otherwise known as the cranium, plus the facial bones. So the cranium plus the facial bones is the skull. The vertebral column, plus the sternum, and the ribs that come off of the vertebral column. Okay? That's the axial skeleton. It's the main axis, anterior, posterior, or superior, inferior if we're talking about humans. That's the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is composed of the limbs plus what are called the girdles. So tetrapods have 4 limbs. We have arms. The arms are associated with the pectoral girdle. The legs are associated with a girdle called the pelvic girdle. Okay? The pectoral and the pelvic girdle. Okay? Right, and I think we mentioned before, these vertebrae come in different types, shapes, with different processes for attachment of different types of muscles in different places, and some of the vertebrae in the axial skeleton are modified for other functions, like the atlas, right, the one up the top that kind of holds your cranium up, etc. Okay? All right. Now what we want to do is take the vertebrate skeleton and make it work. Okay, so in order to do that, we're now going to have to talk about movement, and in this chapter there's a big chunk on the muscles in particular. Okay, so I'm just going to mention a few other types of movements, and then we're going to go right into these muscles as kind of the main focus of our discussion about movement. Okay? All right. There are other systems of movement besides muscular systems. Things like contractile proteins. And some of the primitive animals can use contractile proteins to move things around. There's also amoeboid movement. Right, that relies on an actin system. That would be things like the sperm cell within Ascaris, the intestinal roundworm. That's the genus. They do amoeboid movement. Some of our white blood cells, the macrophages, are capable of this amoeboid movement as well. They use actin molecules, joining them together, separating them in order to accomplish this amoeboid movement. I could also do movement through a hydrostatic skeleton. Hydrostatic skeleton. So there are other ways to move organisms around than muscles. Okay, but muscles is kind of a unique system to animals, very well developed in the vertebrates,